Okay, so now our first panel of the day, we are going to talk about savvy surfing and how to stay safe. Our moderator for today is Katie Jordan. She is a Senior Policy Advisor North America at the Internet Society. She joined the organization in March 2018 and currently supports, develops, and advocates for the Internet Society's internet-related public policy positions on access, security, and privacy in the United States and Canada. Katie received her BA from the University of Virginia, where she majored in Foreign Affairs and Media Studies. After graduation, she worked at Google Public Policy Fellow at New America's Open Technology Institute and as a policy and program manager at Next Century Cities, where she assisted mayors with local broadband, digital inclusion, and civic tech initiatives. Most recently, she served as the development manager at Public Knowledge, where she led development efforts and explored emerging technologies. Katie is based out of Washington in the United States, and she is super excited to be in Canada today. Your moderator, Katie Jordan.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me here. It is always good to be in Canada. Despite the rain, it's kind of nice to escape the just crushing humidity of DC in the summer, so very happy to be here. Want to go ahead and thank all of our panelists as well for joining us today. We have several highly esteemed panelists coming up. Mike Gifford, the founder and CEO of OpenConcept, is here. David Akin, an award-winning journalist and the chief political correspondent for Global News. Kathryn Hill, the Executive Director of MediaSmarts, and Alyssa Moore, the Senior Policy and Advocacy Advisor at Cira. So y'all can go ahead and come up and join me, and I'll give you guys a little bit of an intro on what we'll be talking about today. Thanks. Let's see if we have Kathryn and David. Well, they'll come join us in just a minute. So today we're going to be talking about savvy surfing. And so when I was trying to think about what that meant for the context of this panel, I did a little bit of Googling and typed in all the kind of buzzwords, fake news, misinformation, disinformation, and all of those things. And I wanted to see, is there some sort of consensus on what this means? And it seems like not really. But I think the biggest surprise to me was that when you click on the news section, typing in any of those words, there's an article almost every day with one of them in it. So, today I got a news blurb this morning that there is a video circling around about House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and there's a doctored video of her where her speech has been altered to look as though she's drunk delivering a speech. But it's exploding across social media, and even as politicians are coming out and saying, no, this is fake, and the news media is coming out and saying, no, this is fake, it still exists on the internet. And there are 100 examples of that just from the last month. So clearly this is a really big problem, and it's only going to be increasingly problematic as we move forward and as more people get online. So I want to start off by asking, how many of you think you've seen fake news of some kind? Okay, so almost everybody here. How many of you know someone that's shared it? All right, a little bit less, but still pretty solid amount of this room. And this one's a little bit harder, but how many of you are willing to say that you think you've shared something that then you learned may have been fake? That's still a pretty solid number of people in the room, and I have to think that it's more of us than that, because it's hard to tell sometimes, and that's part of the problem, is you don't always know what's a trusted source and what's not. And that fits in really well with, a report from Cira, actually, about how Canadians view fake news. And that report found that over 70% were concerned with fake news and the impact it could have on an election. 75% said they had come across fake news previously, and 57% said they'd been taken in by fake news. They themselves had read it and thought that it was real. So 87% of people think that this is a problem. And I'm actually surprised that it's not higher than that, because clearly there is a problem if 57% of people know they've shared fake news. But at the same time, there's a lot of hope in this situation as well, because even while all these things are going on, the majority of Canadians, and the vast majority, say that they still trust in traditional news media sources. And that's a really interesting statistic to me because it shows that there's somewhere we can go with this. There is a trusted source that somehow we can lift up and include in the solutions to this problem, even as they're facing plenty of problems of their own. So that's a little bit of background, and I think one thing I'd like to start by talking to you all about is kind of the role of each of those stakeholder groups. So we have, you all represent a variety of organizations doing very different things, but very important things. And I want to talk about how we can take the trust that already exists in media sources, in traditional sources, and in your organizations and other organizations in this room, and figure out how to leverage that to address this problem. So how do you build on the trust that already exists to address the trust that doesn't exist? Melissa, we can start with you.
Sure. So I really like to start by defining our terms first. Misinformation versus disinformation versus fake news. I think many of us mean different things when we talk about it. So it can range anywhere from malicious content that's being distributed for explicit purposes of influencing an election from either a foreign actor or a domestic party. That's like very insidious, clear fake news. But then others, when they say misinformation or disinformation, it could be something as simple as a news source that has a bias towards the other side of the spectrum. And some will decry, oh, this is fake news or this is disinformation. And so it's really murky gray area, and one is obviously much more insidious than the other end of the spectrum. So first, I just want to make sure that we're starting off talking about the same things. And in terms of trust in the system, it's clear in the research that Cira did that yes, the vast majority of Canadians still do trust traditional news media, and we need to make sure that it stays that way by ensuring that the incentives are not cannot be perceived as perverse for media organizations to be disseminating misinformation or to be acting on stories that perpetuate misinformation. So ensuring that the incentives align with dissemination of truthful content.
So I would suggest that what I would like to see happen is for media outlets to go off and encourage greater media, more criticism of their media in general. I'm a regular listener to Jesse Brown's Canadaland show, which is an interesting critique of the media industry, and I think that we need to have more of that. We need to have more people where we're talking about that, whether it's the role of the CBC or the role of other broadcasters, and really trying to make sure that these broadcasters are standing up for the highest level of responsibility with which others will emulate. They're still being held as really critical resources for truth, but we need to be able to admit that when we're wrong and be able to deal with those contradictions when there are different perspectives that are being presented to people about a very complex issue. We can't be trying to continually provide simple sound bites that are essentially clickbait, which might be really useful for driving up our viewership or driving up the attention of a particular story, but ultimately it's about how much can we help drive understanding about the complex world that we live in. And I think that the media can play a bigger role in doing that, whether that's linking to other resources or making sure that we're properly accrediting various different sources of information that we get exposed to, so that people can do the work of following up and understanding more about the complexity of the problems that we're facing.
Thank you. I'm going to pause there just briefly and invite David up to the stage. Thank you so much for joining us. We are talking about kind of how to leverage the trust that already exists in traditional media sources as a way of using the incentives and the different tools in our toolkit to address misinformation. So Kathryn, I'll let you go ahead, and then we'll go to David.
Sure. So I'm with MediaSmarts. That's Canada's Centre for Media and Digital Literacy. This is what we eat and breathe every day, and we are fascinated by and love this stuff, so forgive my enthusiasm. But Canada's really lucky. We're very fortunate that we have maintained the levels of trust in our media, because that's an important part of the solution in this fight against misinformation, disinformation. And what we're about, and so what we believe, is that we're trying to make every citizen be a good, informed digital citizen. And part of that is understanding how to interact with media. And so where media can help with that and help to maintain the levels of trust that we have is in the areas of transparency and accountability. And by transparency, I mean allowing us to see behind the veil of how they create the news, what goes into making something a fact, how do they determine in their editorial processes what they're going to report or not report, what is an opinion piece, very clearly identifying for the consumer or the reader what is opinion versus what is fact, because those things are very different. And in the way we're consuming information now, it's not as clear as it used to be. So we used to have a traditional newspaper, and we knew where the op-ed was, and we knew what the opinion piece was, and it was really clear. And then there was the news section. And then that all started to change, even in traditional media. We had these advertorials, and we weren't quite sure if that was news or if that was paid advertising, and you had to look really carefully to understand whether this was somebody had paid for this, or you were actually reading news in your Toronto Star, your Globe and Mail, or your Ottawa Citizen. And now online, we have a very low level of skill as citizens in knowing how to read online to understand what it is we're reading and whether it is news, how credible it is. So with all of that, I think because of the trust in the media, which again, I just want to highlight, is we are so fortunate. We're like some of the top European countries that have really high media literacy indexes. Canada does not measure that yet. We don't have the frameworks in place yet as a nation, but we do have one of the key indicators, which is a very high trust in media. So it is an excellent starting place, but we do need our media to make sure that we maintain that. And we're never going to go back to where we were 20 years ago. Right? We're all broadcasters now. We're all creators of news and information. We're all part of a web. We're all part of that chain. And so we all have individual responsibility. But the media institutions, and I know there's some efforts, and maybe some folks will speak to them today, but the trust and accountability pieces are going to be critical as we move forward.
Good morning, and my apologies for being late. I thought we were a 10 o'clock start, panelists, audience. Yes. Okay, so I'm glad to be here, and it's a great discussion, and I'm glad I got in on the bit of it. The issue of trust and accountability and sort of a workaday journalist in Canada nowadays is obviously a big issue. Right now, as many of you know, one of the issues that many journalists, I'd be among them, many but not all journalists, and I'd be among them, are a bit concerned about so far as trust goes, is a decision by our federal government to provide certain financial subsidies to some media. And for those who haven't read the fine print of the budget legislation, there is a big pot of money that basically will be available for newspapers only. And one of the discussions that I really find annoying, as a guy who's a print snob and worked for the Globe, the Post, the Orangeville Banner, is our discussion often focuses way too much on newspapers, where not many people go to get their news. You may not know this, but for the last 8 or 9 months, we use ComScore. Any of your ratings agencies, globalnews.ca is the number 2 audience for news in the country after CBC, twice the audience of the Globe and the Star combined. But people will, academics mostly, in their papers, they'll cite the Globe. There's an inquiry going on in British Columbia into money laundering. Why? My colleague who works just up the street, Sam Cooper, busted this whole money laundering thing open. And I find it odd that discussions at a policy level are so focused on newspapers. Okay, that's little rant is over. Back to the $600 million pot of money. It's available only for newspapers. And in all the discussion that we keep having about this is everybody says, oh, the media is being bailed out. No. Not CTV, not Global, not TVR, not Maclean's news magazines or anybody who gets assistance from the Canadian Periodical Fund, not eligible for this big pot of money. It's really just the Toronto Star, the Irvings, the Globe and Mail, and the Post media papers. And just yesterday in the House of Commons, the Heritage Minister, Pablo Rodriguez, was indignantly saying, our journalists, first of all, used the phrase our journalists, which is a little troubling, used the phrase, our journalists can't be bought. And I agree with him on that. I've worked in a lot of newsrooms. I know everybody. We can't be bought. But while I might agree with him on that front, our audiences may wonder. They might wonder. And so trust and accountability starts with, where does the money come from? How do you get paid? You mentioned a minute ago, many of us are media and content creators, right? If you're paying your mortgage by creating content in media, as opposed to just being an interested observer, etc., we need to know where the money goes. For a long time, and I'm surprised that more journalists don't do this, more news organizations don't do this. Somewhere on their website, nice and easy, how do you make your money? If you go to davidakin.com, you'll get my little background bio, and you'll see a disclaimer where I explain to anybody who might be interested, no, I've never been a member of a political party. I am now a member of a union. I'm a Christian in some context. Don't go to church nearly often enough, but in some context, in some writing, that might be something that a reader wants to know to be able to assess my fairness. But I also talk about where the money comes from, that I get paid a salary. I don't work on commission for ads. But see, if we did a survey about a few years ago when I was working for the Sun chain, which the Sun's owner at the time was Quebecor, and many of you may know Pierre-Carl Pelledeau is not a fan of RadCan and CBC. And so we commissioned a poll from Abacus Data, pretty straight up pollster, just asking Canadians, do you know how much the CBC gets every year? And we sort of gave them a range, $10 million a year, $100 million a year. Do you know how much CBC gets? About $1.1 billion a year, and that is as much as all of our economic development agencies combined. That's $1.1 billion a year. I think we ought to be more upfront talking about that. A lot of people say, and that is money well spent. It might be, but the afternoon radio show in Thunder Bay from CBC comes from Sudbury. I used to work for the Chronicle Journal up there. That's like saying the Ottawa radio show is coming from Windsor, like if you've driven that. There's 330 members of the Parliamentary Press Gallery. 1/3 work for CBC or RadCan. Don't we have enough here? Couldn't we have that afternoon drive show in under-service areas like CBC, like Thunder Bay? Where is the money coming from to fund our journalism? I think that is crucial. Why journalism organizations might not want to say on their website, we're advertising supported. Great. Is most of your ads coming from the oil and gas sector? Is there a limit? Like if you got 10% of your revenue coming from the defense industry. It's not to say you're being bought or whatever, but an audience then can then say, okay, your reporting on the defense industry seems adequate, or oil and gas, along those lines. So I think we can talk more about some of the processes within a newsroom, but I think at the font of it, we have to talk about how journalism is funded. There's a lot of great new business models. National Observer is a good one, doing some fabulous investigative work, and they're by and large reader-funded, user-funded. And they've got a particular editorial bent, which is fine, but they're being upfront. We need funding from users to continue to exist. We need to, as I think that's a really important thing for everybody, local, national, international. Where does the money come from?
It's a really good point. And I think it's very interesting because as I'm hearing each of you talking, I hear a lot about responsibility. It's a responsibility of the news media to say where their money comes from. It's a responsibility of, again, news media to push for those trust elements and protect those trust elements. It's the role of social media to, elevate those traditional news elements, and it's the role of federal government to provide funding not just to newspapers but to all media. So how do we break?
I mean, that's the thing, right? Or not, that the government
Sure.
shouldn't be providing funding to media, or to do it to underserviced areas, the north, that sort of thing, as opposed to more journalists for the Parliamentary Press Gallery.
Sure. So, and I think that's a really important point, though, because the responsibility of each of these actors, we need to find a balance between them, and especially lifting up the voices of underserved areas. I think that's critical. But so how do we divide up that role? What is the responsibility of social media, government, traditional media, the public, civil society, academia, all of these groups. How do each of them play a role in this? Because it seems to me, based on the way the kind of stakeholder groups you all have talked about, that all of them have something to do here.
So in our research, when Cira asked Canadians who holds responsibilities for these things, the answer was it's a shared responsibility. 72% said social media companies have a responsibility to combat disinformation. 68% said it's incumbent on the media, whether it's traditional newspapers, broadcasters. 67% said citizens themselves have a responsibility to inform themselves, to learn how to critically think about the content they're consuming. 63% said journalists, so that journalists should be abiding by a code of ethics and fact-checking. And then 50%, so this is the lowest, said that the federal government has a responsibility here. So whether that means to legislate or to regulate, but it's quite clear that it's a shared responsibility. And so in developing the solutions to the problem of combating misinformation, it needs to be a multi-stakeholder approach, as we say in the internet governance community, that everyone needs to be consulted in a fulsome manner. So events like this, where people from all different elements of industry are getting together to talk about it from their different perspectives. When the federal government reviews legislation. So right now we're in the midst of a Broadcasting and Telecommunications Act review. We also have this digital charter that was announced last week. It's important that all parts of the picture are consulted in this process. So civil society is super important to bring to the table, to be the consumer voice, to be the watchdog, to make sure that these things are implemented in a transparent way. Industry, so the platforms that have the power over ultimately what is in front of the eyeballs and on your computer, what you're consuming. They know the secret sauce behind what they're doing and what gets in front of eyeballs. And then government, of course, who has a responsibility to protect citizens, really, but in a way that does not infringe upon, our freedom to consume or to write what we want. So, yeah, super shared responsibility.
I think that what I'd like to emphasize is that there's so much of the time when you're looking at responsibility for something as broad as responsibility on how we deal with the future of the internet. It's either we're looking towards international bodies like Akin, or we're looking at governments taking responsibility to regulate, and or the individuals and their individual choices and decisions. And I think that there's actually quite a lot of people quite a lot of organizations that are between that are in between that state of being able to that have a lot of influence, and that are not presently being properly, not leveraging that experience right now in order to go off and to see that their concerns about having a fair and equitable internet are being respected. And so I think that there's ways that so many small and medium organizations can be involved in talking. If you're buying Facebook ads, well, you can talk to Facebook and say, we need to have better policies on X, Y, and Z, or we will not buy from you. Trying to go off and set up clear guidelines for supporting the kind of internet that we want, and making that as something that allows us to move progressively in that direction by supporting the good elements of the media and the internet, and to step away from some of the more disastrous ones. So.
I think I would echo everything that's said. It is a whole community approach. So you need regulatory responses, you need responses from the platforms themselves around what they are going to do or not do, and they are looking to government for regulatory support to some degree. I think we've moved beyond the notion that they're just neutral platforms where information is shared. We know that they have a role, they have agency, They have their algorithms. Those algorithms decide for each and every one of us what we're going to consume. It isn't random. And your Google is different from my Google, is different from your Google. So they're not just a neutral. And they're starting to acknowledge that, and so that's progress, but that's because of community pressure and government pressure. And then individual citizens. So it is all three. And as individual citizens who have the wonder of the internet available to us, which is a beautiful, fabulous thing. I mean, we lived, I'm an old lefty, so 25 years ago, I was frustrated as heck with mainstream media. And now mainstream media has become a term that we use to describe fake news, and that has been co-opted by the alt-right to describe something else entirely. But it has opened up information. It has democratized information and information sharing. The challenge with that is that there have been actors who have taken advantage of that and have used it for other reasons. And mostly it's to try and trick us. And so I don't feel like being tricked. I don't feel like being manipulated. I didn't like it back when I was young and didn't like who, in Toronto was deciding what was news or not news, and I don't like it now. So I have an opportunity, we all have opportunities to engage, and we all can, and there's tons of evidence to support this. We create our communities online. And they're as real as offline. Online and offline have merged now. We used to talk about them as separate things. It's one world. So we create these communities, and we can create the standards or the norms that guide them. We can do that, and it only takes 2 to 3% of us to be actually challenging, gently suggesting what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. It's usually the loudest and most egregious voices are a small 10%. And there's documented evidence, lovely research to support this. If just 3 to 4% of us actually engage in a way that say, hey, no, not good. Ezra, posting that on Twitter, really not cool. Not good. Don't need you doing that. And we know why you're doing it, Ezra. You're just doing it to get likes so you can sell some advertising. You're not going there. If we all start doing that, we can dramatically change what's happening in our online environment.
I had the good fortune a couple of weeks ago. NATO, as you may know, is engaged in information warfare against the Russians. And they have a NATO Strategic Communications Center in Riga. And there was a group from that communication center that came over to brief members of the Parliamentary Press Gallery a couple of weeks ago, and it was fascinating. We're not on the information warfare front lines here in Canada the way they are in the Baltic countries, but some thoughts. If you may know some of this background, and some of it may be new to you. So in Latvia, the government there actually took stations off the air that were broadcasting clearly false Russian content, Russian propaganda. That's an extraordinary step for a government to take on a broadcaster. And there are a host of other rules prohibiting certain kinds of content from showing up in the feeds, let's call it, the media feeds, in these Baltic countries. And this was a journalist, an investigative journalist from Latvia, who was presenting us this information, and I asked her about how that went over among journalists. I know if that happened in Canada or the United States, there'd be a lot of people going, hold on a second. If we actually, I don't know if this is going on, Katie, in the U.S. about having RT registered as a foreign agent. It may have happened already, I'm not sure. So there's various government responses to information warfare that we probably haven't conceived and ought to be thinking about. NATO's kind of on it. I'm going to point that to a resource. But speaking of registries and the responsibility of registries, one of the great tools that these journalists are using, I wish I had it handy, it's sitting in my notes, is basically, it's an automated, essentially, to map if you run across a website that's pretty dubious, you can quickly look up to see where this registry is. It's a whois, but it's a very specific kind of whois lookup function that then lets us see all the other domains this bad actor is pushing stuff out on, and then you can start tracing the money and tying it back up. Of course, all through whether it's Cira or any number of sort of registries around the world, is how anonymous ought a website holder, a registrant, to be. There's many good reasons, obviously, for anonymity. You are providing health advice to the lesbian and gay community, and there's lots of countries where if we find out who's doing that, there's big trouble. We can clearly see from the West, from our society, there's a value in that. But that's a discussion that has been going on ever since there's been a registry, and continues. But in light of changing events, again, there are other countries, and I'm going to single out those 3 Baltic countries, who are looking at that as a way how governments can quite boldly step in ways that might make Canadian and American audiences a little uncomfortable. But they're right there on the front lines, and they felt they had to.
Can I respond to a couple of points that have been made? So that's a super interesting model. I hadn't heard about that yet. For the record, at Cira, an individual registrant of a .ca is by default, they get privacy protection, so your name and your phone number and your address don't appear in the WHOIS in Canada. But that's not true of all registries, and there are over 1,000 top-level domains now, and it's not true of registrants in the EU now, because with the GDPR, individual registrants are required to have that privacy protection in place. But it's quite an interesting model, and I learned yesterday that there was a study done in Finland who has apparently been combating misinformation from Russian interference for quite a bit longer than we have in the West, it seems. And students there are much more capable of identifying what is disinformation and what is not. So there's hope for us, I guess, through those stats. And then the other thing I wanted to address was you talked about communities and our power to shape them online. I recently learned that on Reddit, so if you've been on the front page of Reddit, there might be 3,000 or 4,000 upvotes on a given post, but it appears at the top of the page and it could be on the front page for hours. So only 3,000 or 4,000 upvotes, but that gets in front of millions of eyeballs. So such a small portion of the community is defining what gets seen. So when you actually begin to engage in those types of content deliberation engagement, you really are defining the community in a very real way. A fraction of a percentage is determining what millions of people see. So there's power in that, and that's what I love about the internet.
That's a really good point. And I want to pick on a couple of things that you guys have all said, because it's really interesting to me. First of all, I heard multiple people say collaboration, multi-stakeholder, working together, and as Andrew said in his keynote speech, the Canadian, many different stakeholders in Canada have been involved in this multi-stakeholder process over the last year for IoT security. And they've proven themselves to really be a champion of the multi-stakeholder process, involving ISED, Cira, CIPIC, Canary, Internet Society, and others. So we know that that's something that Canada does really well. But you guys also, I keep hearing you talk about global organizations and regional organizations, everything from the registries to social media platforms that exist on a global scale. So, and I also heard you talk about kind of the blending between the offline world and the online world. So what does that mean for kind of our borders and the way we address these issues in Canada? What kind of collaboration has to happen here, but then also what kind of collaboration has to happen beyond the physical borders that we've created because the internet has no borders?
Just jump in on that one first, just quickly, because you probably may have touched on this, or I'm sure this event, broadly speaking, is in tide with what's going on with our House of Commons Ethics Committee these few days, the Grant Committee, and that is the extraterritoriality of many of major players, and we're obviously here talking Facebook, Google, etc. And Canada is a middle power, and yes, Facebook can kind of go, sorry, Cheryl and Zuckerberg aren't coming. And there's little we can do about it except pass a motion in the House of Commons. But 30 million Canadians, or however many, 25 million Canadians who are on Facebook are going to shrug, and they're going to continue to use it. And I guess at some point, Canada has to be talking with its multilateral organizations, I cover a lot of G20 summits, for example, and this is starting, or in the last couple of G20s, has started to percolate the extraterritoriality of many of these players. But I guess Canada could maybe push a bigger discussion about what do we do when these players aren't playing. And we hear Zuckerberg say, I want to play, I want to do it all, I think we should have one global rule for regulation. But we're not going to have one global rule. We're a bilingual country. There's other countries that are multilingual, and there's other countries that are unilingual. Just in language alone is we're going to get tied up. But again, that would be my big thing. I mean, there's lots of non-government organizations, registries, etc. But I think that would be a role for Canada to push, and that may come out of the Ethics Committee's recommendations to use our standing at various existing multilateral fora, UN, G20s, even G7s, to play a little hardball.
I think there are some regulatory solutions, and there have been some. The European Union, the GDRP, they were able to do a great deal and influence tremendously. And so individual nations can. They can set regulations for within their geographic boundaries. They may be different, but I think, so it sounds cliched, but the ongoing call for collaboration. So certainly Canada with the EU would be much more influential than Canada alone or the EU alone. So those are, I think, those pressures are coming to bear, and I think our government is aware of them, and they are paying attention, as are many governments. And just to highlight that Finland study is a really interesting one for people who are interested. It's Open Society that is the group that did the research, and I think what's fascinating about that one is it was 2015, the Prime Minister of Finland made a call to all citizens of the nation to fight against misinformation. So as far back as 2015, but that's because they're neighbors with Russia and they're used to Russian propaganda. And a lot of this is just about propaganda, especially when we're talking politics. And they implemented nationally. Now it's much easier for them. Canada's large, we have provinces that have jurisdiction, never mind federal jurisdiction. But really their efforts were focused, and why the youth are able to fight is that they've implemented from kindergarten through to university and then community-wide with adults and seniors, because seniors are amongst the worst sharers of misinformation on the planet. And I get to call myself part of that group now, so yay for my cohort. But we're abysmal. So all of us need training around this stuff. But regulatory, yes, is important. The borders are fascinating. We can't make them come here. They're not Canadians. Our law doesn't apply there. So we probably shouldn't try. We should probably try other ways of having influence and setting some regulation that will have some teeth and will. And again, it's all about norms. The things that we value as Canadians are even really different from what Americans value. I mean, this foundational free speech passion that Americans have, right? It's in it's their core. And so Canadians have conversations about negotiating values and negotiating free speech. That's just unthinkable to most of American values. So culturally, there are big differences amongst our countries, but we can figure out norms around those and regulations around those.
So just a quick sort of poll of the audience. How many of you here use Google as your primary search engine? Okay, who uses DuckDuckGo at all? Okay, the few people. How many people use a Canadian search engine? Oh, is there one? Okay. Okay. So this is definitely global, and I wanted to say quickly about DuckDuckGo. I mean, they if you use DuckDuckGo, they're not going to go off and give you personalized results. I use DuckDuckGo as my primary search engine, and so that I get generic results, so they're the same. So we have the same search results back and forth. Whereas sometimes I need to find something, and DuckDuckGo doesn't give me the answers, and so I go to Google, because Google has the data. I've been providing Google the data about things that I'm interested in, and they can provide more highly personalized results that serve my needs sometimes better than anything else. On the other hand, I'm also serving them. I'm giving them data, giving them power, and giving them knowledge over me when I do that. So, trying to make a conscious choice so that we're not using our default search engine being the one that is collecting more information about us, like the kinds of information that even Facebook knows about us, about our identities, even if we don't post it online. Like the news from Cambridge Analytica, the power of being able to take that information and be able to really create these micro personality profiles that they can assign against everyone who's using it, everyone who's liked a painting or liked a photo or being involved in commenting on different issues. Like, there's enough big data that we can find a lot of information about ourselves, or that algorithms can find specific information about us that our closest friends may not even know if we're participating more actively involved in these, and so we have to be aware of this reality and have and also start to be more critical of the platforms that we're using. I think that there's a lot of like global surveillance capitalism is something that it's not going to be defined to a particular country. Shopify's our big local sort of tech startup here, and they're doing some really amazing stuff. But they're trying to build a platform, and I think that there's a lot of advantages for a company to go off and to build a platform, but there's a lot of consequences with that. There were a lot of businesses that like mine that built e-commerce shops for businesses across Canada before Shopify came and made it simple for everyone to go off and to, at a click of a button, build a commerce engine that simplified it for everyone. There's advantages to Shopify, but there's also a lot of people who are not doing that e-commerce work in Canada because Shopify has disrupted that industry and set up a platform that gives them control to skim off so much of the profits off of all of the transactions that are taking place there. So I just think that we need to be aware of the pros and cons of the platforms we're using, and they are global. They're not going to be something that is Canadian that we can work with just within Canada.
So you asked about international cooperation and problems of jurisdiction. And there are already international organizations where policy around internet issues are made. But they're mostly sort of at the lower layers of the network technology stack. So you've got down below, you've got the infrastructure. In the middle, you've got sort of the intelligence in the network that defines how a query from your computer gets to another computer. And then you have the applications or the content on top. So there's the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, where companies from all around the world responsible for domain name registries such as Cira, all of the other country codes, all of the generic top-level domains like .com, .ninja, .sucks, what have you, get together and they make norms, regulations, policies around how these things interoperate to make sure that the internet is interoperable on a global level. There's the Internet Engineering Task Force that, through their request for comment process, develops the protocols that define how these networks function and how our computers talk to each other. And that's all a grassroots, bottom-up, international process that anyone can go and participate in. They're wide open meetings. But that's all at the lower layers of that network stack. It's the protocols, it's the infrastructure. There's not really anything like that yet at the upper layers, the application, the content, that's used in a really big way. So there are forums where discussions about these things take place. There's the Internet Governance Forum, which is a body of the United Nations, where groups come together and have started to have some of these conversations. There are other initiatives. There's the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, who is meeting next week in Berlin. So these conversations are starting to be had in a multi-stakeholder fashion. Governments are coming to the table, industry is coming to the table, and civil society is coming to the table. But it's just not quite as developed as it is on the lower layers of the network stack yet. And I think we're going to see that become increasingly important in the near future.
I was just thinking as you talked about IETF lists, I was at, is this on? 1, 2, 3? Should I do something?
Try the one next to you.
Say, oh, there it is. It's always that way, isn't it? Is this on?
Is this on?
Oh, there it is. Good. So I just when you mentioned IETF, so I was a tech reporter back in the days when you had to explain to people what the internet was in your newspaper copy, or what I covered the, have you heard about this thing called an MP3? So that's where I am, sort of circa IETF. There's a lot of mailing lists, IETF engineers, and I was on a couple.
You're going to have to tell people what an MP3 is.
Yeah. So the equivalent in a newsroom where you get, and if you've been on these engineers lists, where people are going to the mat over, solid technical specs, important ones, but I mean, to a layperson, I'm not an engineer, it seemed like, guys, what are you arguing about? So the equivalent in the newspaper business would be the copy editor or the fact checker. And those are disappearing at an unbelievably rapid rate. And that goes straight to the heart at sort of our application layer of trust. Trust in content. I don't know how many people, if I have a mistake in my online copy, will come back to me and say, didn't your fact checkers get that? Are you kidding me? We haven't had fact checkers. I think the last time I had someone an actual fact checker, probably when the Globe and Mail Saturday edition was still 140 pages of actual newspaper. So how many years? 20? But that would only be for stories I had in the Globe that were going in the focus section, the big long reads right in the middle of the paper. If it was my daily copy that I'm cranking out, nobody's going to fact check that. We just don't have it. The best we might get were copy editors. And we used to have something called the RIM. And those who've ever been in the business, it literally would be a bunch of copy deskers sitting in a sort of circular way, and copy would get, at one point, physically passed around the rim, and it would get marked up, and you would see 3, 4, 5 eyes, and there'd be intense arguments about where a comma went, about how we would characterize this. What do we call people who are against abortion? Pro-lifers, no, they're anti-abortion. I mean, those very important sort of content arguments, etc. Those are disappearing, and there is some effort at, the front line content people who are on Twitter and a byline, you'll see bylines, but the people backing me up, if I send copy off to in Global's, I'm sure Global's very typical of CBC or CTV or the Globe and Mail. So I generate copy and it goes off to another shop where there is somebody who's going to read it, but I can't recall the last time I had somebody call up and say, can we talk about your story structure? Or are you sure you explain this concept very well? It doesn't happen. Most of the copy editors now, because they're editing copy online, are really, how can we add in more video? How can we add in more links? How can we keep the eyeballs on the page? How can we maximize SEO? That's what our business has come down to. And the trust part is really left, the trust as a brand proposition, it's not baked in anymore. We do talk about it. We know it's important. We know that's our calling card is trust as part of our brand. It's why the New York Times versus just any old sort of thing. We think the New York Times has an association with trust. Well, Donald Trump doesn't, of course, but most of us do. Anyways, I just wanted to make that observation that from a technology point, yes, we've got those gaps and holes, but then from an old-fashioned process layer in our news businesses, we're missing a key back office sort of function where there was a lot of trust creation, which is, I don't know how we restore that. Maybe all this money from the government.
Oh, well, I was going to say, not that I work in the journalism world, so certainly you would know far better about Global, but CBC just announced this morning, they've spoken about it earlier, they've created a whole fact-checking unit for CBC News, and so... I
listen to CBC radio every morning. My kids who I drive to school say, Dad, stop yelling at the radio most mornings. I mean, I wish them blessed. I make mistakes too. I'm not throwing things, but we all got a long, long way to go on that. There's so much content from CBC, you would need an army to back up they have just so much content. But it's a start.
They are. They are committing to it, and there's the Trust and Integrity Initiative out of Toronto that the Toronto Star is a part of, and a few other papers. So journalism is responsible. We're trying to respond with fact-checking. Pointer is a great source in the United States.
Not when I have to have my copy up in 2 hours. That's the problem.
Well, there is that. I mean, in the information age and the speed, there is a tremendous pressure on journalists to get the story out without adequate support, and that's part of the problem. But it's a bigger issue for those of us who consume news, because we want to be able to trust our news sources. And if we don't trust our news sources, then what's going to happen? So it's a really worrisome piece of information you're bringing us today.
That's been a trend for 10 years. That's not just happened yesterday. That decline in the trust function, the trust shop, copy desk.
Yeah, that's really good context. And I also think it sounds like when the problem is this big, the kind of incremental steps that we can make are super important. And having that context and knowing that maybe that's the first incremental step is really good insight. And Alyssa, I'm so glad that you brought up all the different ways in which Canada is already participating in kind of global forums. I think that those organizations and those forums do provide a really good way for Canadian stakeholders to collaborate on a global scale. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that ISED's also participating on an IoT security policy platform that will take the work that the multi-stakeholder group has done and carry it to a global level. So I think that there's a lot of collaboration happening, and this is just an issue that needs to be taken to that level as well. So I have a ton of other questions for you guys. I think this is a fantastic conversation, but I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody in the audience who may have a question. So we can start back there. I think, do we have a mic runner? I know for the live stream, it'll only pick it up. Sorry, hang on one second. We'll get you a mic so that the live stream can catch it also.
This is a great talk. I loved everyone's perspectives. It's getting a lot of wheels turning, but Sarah McIntyre, participant, one of our sponsors. One of my clients, BAI Canada, is one of our gold sponsors here. But my question is, I guess, a fewfold, and I think David and I have talked about this in different times about when people are getting information or quote-unquote news, are they looking to validate their already existing views and therefore self-selecting mediums that support that? So that's one question. And the other question I have is, when we talk about who's responsible for content, that always makes me think of who's watching the watchers, and where we are kind of with this digital charter at some point federally is, okay, if someone's saying something's fake news and something else is not fake news, what is the litmus test? And it's a worthy conversation. And then the last point I'll make is the kind of comparison between Ukraine and Russian media. Russia doesn't really have media. It's state-owned propaganda. And so I think kind of delisting them is similar to the fight we had with some of the Chinese media, as you'll remember, David. And how do you balance that you are trying to have an open parliamentary press gallery, but not everyone adheres to the same values as you do in a Western democracy. So it kind of poses a lot of other kind of challenges. So that's a lot, and I'll pass it over to you guys.
Well, I'll pick up to your point, Sarah, just about who's watching the watchers. And my belief is, and this is certainly an arguable point, but the audience is watching. You're a consumer of our news, and if we're not doing a very good job, there's a lot of choices for you to go somewhere else. This goes back to, right now, I'm a member of Unifor. Jerry Diaz is the head of Unifor, and for some reason he's decided that he's going to campaign specifically against Andrew Scheer and the Conservative Party. If Jerry wants to vote for everyone, that's fine, but he's out there as the president of Unifor, sort of campaigning against Unifor. And unfortunately, that means that a lot of our audience now thinks members of Unifor are out campaigning against, and we're going to be whatever. And I've been trying to explain to my Unifor brothers and sisters, it's bad for our business when this happens, because if there's an audience that thinks we're in the tank for Party X, or we're not credible on political coverage any longer, There's lots of choice. The National Observer, Rabble.ca, Press Progress, which is, I have many friends that do you know what Press Progress is? It's a great site, and in the Alberta election, they were, quote, breaking stories, i.e., getting information from the NDP opposition war room and kicking around UCP candidates. We had to follow. It's great stuff. But it's very murky. We don't know where all the money gets paid. There's no bylines on it, et cetera, et cetera. But our audience will go there knowing that they're pretty upfront rather than us. That's the big danger. So audience will be the watching the watchers. And audiences are savvy. Audiences will fisk us. Did I get that the right term there? They'll rubber fisk or whatever. They'll be able to dig into stuff and come at us. So that's the first thing. And then Sarah's other point about do you look for information, sources, expert that validate your own view? Again, I think audiences have to challenge news outlets to challenge themselves. And I can only, this is probably taught in journalism schools. I didn't go to J school, but I do wake up in the morning. I want to find a worldview that somebody hasn't considered, that somebody's challenging things. I'm looking for new evidence to point me in a new direction. And I think a lot of journalists do have that impulse, but you got a 2-hour deadline, or you're playing to somewhere else in an hour, and you rely on a source who is quick and can get back to you, but may have views that are not challenging you. It's very difficult, but it's something that I think, again, the back office function, an editor who reads your copy saying, did you seek out this? And I say that doesn't mean we automatically have to have balance. And there's been, I know the BBC has just gone through this. Whenever you do a story about the climate crisis, you do not have to balance it with someone who says there's no climate change existing. That's not balance. Balance is something else. It's not that. Somebody saying, no, there's no climate change, to yes, there's climate change. Difficult questions, but just basically audiences are king, and we now can measure our audiences with such unbelievable precision. We know when we're screwing up, and our audiences know when we're screwing up, and that is a good check.
I can answer the one about are we just cherry picking the information? I forget where, way back there. So we tend to, yes, that's human nature. That's our brain. It's what our brain likes, and our brain tends to drive our behavior. So it's confirmation bias. We like to, and it's why fake news has become so important, or misinformation. So one, we don't get our information just from the news. That's the big change. Right? That's the whole paradigm shift that is happening. Information comes from everywhere, not just from the news. And not all information is news, but it is information that we are consuming in an information age that is also a post-truth era. And what that means is we are attracted to and we like the information that confirms what we already believe. And the stuff that makes us angry or the stuff that makes us scared is the stuff that sticks. So that's another part of this big problem. It's quite complex, but at the root of it, yep, we remember this stuff that we, at some level, it's not even conscious, subconsciously fits with our values and triggers us either because it scares us, or mostly because it scares us or makes us angry. We're less likely to remember the stuff that makes us happy, unfortunately. We remember the stuff that makes us scared and angry, or sad. So yep, that's what we're doing, and that's why we're really concerned about the impact on democracy and the impact on elections and the impact on our society, because it is driving and triggering our basest instincts, and we need to, as good digital citizens, rise above, know what's going on, recognize that that's happening, and as you described, start to look elsewhere.
You grabbed so many of my ideas, so I just, which is great. I think that we need to try and think, going back to the Russia-China sort of question, their government system does not depend on a free and critical media in order to go off and help citizens be able to make conscious decisions about what is right for society. Ours does. All democracies, if they're functioning democracies, rely on the media to go off and to convey information to ensure that they play a critical role in creating an informed populace. If we don't have that media that's providing that role, and that could be online media, it could be social media, if we don't have some sort of mechanism that's helping us as a society make better decisions, we're not going to be able to go off and be functioning particularly well in democracies. And I look at some of the recent elections that we've had, and whether that's Trump's election, or whether it's Brexit, or for that matter Ford here in Ontario, and I think that there's so much that points to us not being the clear rational actors that we all think we are, but ultimately we're not. We make decisions based on a whole bunch of issues, and I think that our media needs to help us be able to aspire to be that informed populace that is able to help make critical decisions as a group if we're going to survive as a democracy going ahead.
I don't think I have anything new to add to any of that. I've covered it.
Thank you all. Do we have any other questions? Yes.
I was wondering, it seems that the discussion that's going around is about media is supposed to provide us with the opportunity to, is the responsibility of stopping the spread of fake news. It seems like there's all these elements and players, and I just wonder what you are feeling about the role perhaps of all these players in educating the population. Like, I believe that user awareness, education, the development of capabilities might be, I keep on hammering this in every, it might be what is required to do. Like, you see a fake news, are we being educated to actually go and use the tools, like Andrew actually was saying, the same tools that are providing all this? Are we being educated? Is the population have the skills? Is there enough efforts in, regardless of everything, to be able to take a piece of news and to do the search on your own? What are your thoughts on that?
I think test. I think ultimately what you're talking about is teaching critical thinking, and in part that is something that's incumbent upon the school system to teach critical thinking to kids from a very young age as it pertains to things that you're going to see online. It's also a responsibility of civil society and organizations like MediaSmarts, who are doing fantastic work in that regard. I'm not so sure that it's necessarily the responsibility of the news organizations producing the content. They're news organizations, that's what they do. I don't think that they're the correct arbiters of, or correct mediators of what should you be thinking. Ultimately, you get to choose what you're going to consume. So yeah, and it's perhaps a government and education piece throughout school as well as civil society.
I just wanted to add that it's not critical thinking that I'm talking about. I'm talking of the development of capabilities, skills, tools that will lead to the
Behavioral changes that we're talking about.
It's not critical thinking necessarily. It's the development of awareness, education, and new elements and new opportunities and new challenges, and how to use the tools. So it's the development of capabilities, awareness, and education. And I didn't refer to necessarily the media is supposed to do it, but I'm saying who is supposed to do it, because I think that it also, as you were mentioning, it's a multi-prong approach to many actors, and everybody has a responsibility of developing the awareness and education in the users and the citizens.
I just got to say that there's we have to think a little bit about the system that this is being in, and what are the incentives that are driving both the internet businesses as well as the news media, and that's capitalism. At the moment, capitalism is driving for essentially profits, as many profits as you can get, and especially venture capital is driving organizations to, it's not just enough to be profitable, you have to be more profitable than you were the previous quarter. And that drive is I think responsible for a lot of the problems in the media, as well as, like, it's not good enough that the National Post is a profitable newspaper, if it is, and I don't think it is, but that isn't a good enough margin or a measure of success. It's a question of, will it provide more relative stakeholder value than other options, and how you compete with the silicon giants out there. And unless we sort of say, well, we need to rethink these incentives that we're playing by, and look at ways that we can take all of these businesses and say, well, we need them to actually be supporting democracy and not eroding it. And there are businesses like the National Observer is a certified benefit corporation. So is OpenConcept. This is a business model. It's a business model that tries to support. I'm not sure. That tries to support. There we go. The idea of being good for the planet, good for the people, and good for the community. We need to have more people, more kinds of industries that are supporting this type of holistic thinking. And yes, we still need to make a profit out of it, but we need to be able to think about things beyond just how do we get the most clicks for whatever we're trying to build, and until we adjust that systemic change, we're not going to make a lot of progress.
So I don't know that, it is working. Okay, I'm going to start singing now just to drive the organizers crazy. So thank you for the question. Full transparency, I'm totally biased. I'm the executive director of a media literacy organization. So yes, critical thinking is key, it's foundational, but there are also skills that people need to learn and that we haven't learned and we haven't been taught. We've been around for 24 years. We have spent all of those 24 years fighting to get this content into the curriculums in Canada. We don't have any power, we don't have a lot of leverage. We create and then we gift it to the nation and hope that people will use. We lead them down the path. We take every curriculum for every province and territory, for every grade from K to 12, for every subject, and we map out where you can add media literacy or digital literacy to your course, whether it's grade 9 biology, grade 2 math. We give you the lesson plan, the handouts, the exercises in a package, and we're still only reaching about 1 million students a year. And all of it is available free of charge. We do it through our fundraising and through our own efforts. And so we've got an uphill mountain to climb still in Canada. Finland, which is doing beautifully, and had the motivation of Russia on their doorstep, has implemented this across the country in all grades starting in 2016. So, and they've created a citizenry and youth that are well able to identify and deal with, and they don't have a problem, or very much less of a problem. And they've got a really sophisticated neighbor. So there's a lot more that we could do. It's hard in a federation because provinces have jurisdiction over education, not the federal government, and so it's each province and territory at a time. We don't have a national will around this yet. Maybe the digital charter will help, I don't know, but that's certainly what we're constantly advocating for, is we need to prepare our citizens.
I'll do a quick one if that's okay.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I'm going to take president privilege because if I've got these really smart people in front of me, I've got some questions I'm dying to ask. I just got one. So when I'm not doing the Internet Society and their president, I run another organization called Equal Voice, which is about getting more women elected. And one of the huge pushes that we've been looking at, and there's a committee in front of the Justice Committee right now talking about hate speech and trolling and all of the insidious things that go on in the bottom of the newspaper sections when you click down, or just, the internet in general. So there's this march I'm seeing towards Let's pull down hate. Let's make sure that it's immediately eradicated. Let's take it off as soon as it hits the, is George Orwell somewhere saying, hold my beer? Like, should I, as my internet society, when I have that hat on, should I be, like, while I want more women to run and I want them to not have those experiences online and I want all of that, I also still want to say nasty things about politicians sometimes if they're wrong, as long as I'm not saying I'm going to kill you. But I want to be able to comment. I want to be able to say when they're making wrong-headed moves. I want to be able to have all of that discussion without fear that it's going to be pulled down. So if we are rushing to, if the push is to pull down as soon as it's up there anything that might be wrong or fake or all of those things, how do we make sure that stuff that isn't wrong or fake or something that once we regulate and give them the power, how do we take it back when it's abused, is my fear as the internet society person.
Let me just get on the how to get more women to run, and I'll use the case right now of our Environment Minister, Kathryn McKenna, who in the House of Commons, with real live people, it gets called Climate Change Barbie. That's not online, that's real live members of Parliament insulting the Environment Minister, who, if you don't know our Environment Minister, she has very blonde hair, and she gets called Climate Change Barbie. Similarly, insulting things get hurled by liberal politicians. They're not immune from it either. This is real live. Now, in the House of Commons, the rules of televising things means only the speaker can be shown on TV. It's controlled by the House of Commons. Only the person who's speaking can be shown on TV, or the Speaker of the House of Commons. That's why I go there every day, so I can see who are the idiots yelling things at other people. And it happens on all sides. Maybe lifting the veil of anonymity in the House of Commons so we can see the hecklers would quell the hecklers. Now let's think about where the heckling and the hate speech comes online. It comes from anonymous sources, by and large. It's trolls. Facebook, weirdly enough, because people on Facebook are less likely to be anonymous than, say, Twitter, has less of a problem than Twitter in terms of this sort of thing, or so I've been told. So I guess as a society and as platforms, how much do we value anonymity versus reducing online hate? And the Justice Committee is, I think, they're meeting right now, 11 o'clock, starting this study. That seems to me to be where a lot of the discussion is happening. You have to be accountable for what you said. As we've shown here today, we'll all be civil in our discussions. I think that is a really important thing we're going to have to address, both in the real world, in the House of Commons, and in our online speech.
I think, probably amongst the worst things that could happen is for it to all go underground, because then we don't know what we're dealing with. The best thing to happen is for all of us to create the norms and to police it ourselves. And so in the way that you just pointed out, we're having a civil discourse here. We learned how to do that as a society. Probably 1,000 years ago, we weren't so well behaved, and we didn't all sit and turn off we didn't have phones, but we didn't follow the rules, or we followed the rules that existed. We haven't created the norms yet. It's because of anonymity. There's huge empathy gaps. People are showing their worst selves, and they're misbehaving. And part of what we need to do is educate ourselves and everyone around us about how we need to behave. It's the same as how we behave here, is the same as how I behave in 2 seconds when I pick up my phone, because we are all carrying it around with us, and at any moment can say anything we want to anyone. I can say something to the Prime Minister. I can say something to the President of the United States. I just have to put his account. So it's gonna take us some time. But nobody, I think, most of us who really are engaged with the online world don't want to see regulation to the point where we're stifling discourse and disagreement and discord, because that's an essential part of a democracy.
Culture change takes a lot of time, and not saying that just be patient, it'll come in time, because it's been long enough, but it will take a lot more time before we have that. But it is good to see people like Alex Bonet and others who are taking leadership in the digital space and saying, I'm not going to be on any all-male panels anymore. Panels are a thing of the past. We can get over that. And as a leader, I'm not going to be stepping up and being on a all-male panel. That's not quite the same as dealing with the the level of vile garbage that's on. Like, if you look at Kathryn McKenna's Twitter feed and you read the comments that she gets, it's upsetting. It's like, I don't know how she or other women who are so easily targeted by the internet can read the vile stuff that is hurled at them. But that being said, we need to have more women in politics, and we need more brave women doing that, and we need more men stepping up. And when people go off and call, say stupid, obnoxious, misogynist nonsense, they need to be able to be held account, and that men need to step up and be able to talk about this in a way that to say, yes, it's not all right to call Kathryn McKenna, a climate change Barbie. That is not an acceptable thing for somebody who has the leadership and the authority and the position that she has. Even if she didn't, it's not an appropriate thing to call her. The other thing is, I'm noticing that it's not just anonymous issues either. I've been engaging with some climate change people, or some climate change trolls on LinkedIn, who are basically trying to push the denial thing. And there's very little that is more, or like less anonymous than LinkedIn, in that you have all of your professional credentials there. This is where you're hoping to go off and get a job. And there are quite a few people who are denialists and who are actively saying, oh, this is all just a hoax, this is nonsense. And it's shocking to go off and see people treat Facebook or LinkedIn like Facebook, because in a modern society where people are hoping to go off and engage with serious people into serious space, it's shocking to go off and to see people who are reducing, or just willing, who believe it well enough that this is a hoax, that they're willing to step up without going off and doing the digging and the research to go off and to go against the UN Economic Program or the other agencies that are trying to raise awareness about climate change issues.
So I think we need to remember, and we talked a bit about it earlier, how the internet is cross-jurisdictional. And anonymity in many jurisdictions still has a very important place and serves a very important purpose on the internet, to be able to say certain things that oppressive regimes may not agree with. However, that's very different from sustained online harassment and sustained campaigns of hate speech. And in this particular jurisdiction, we have hate speech laws and the tools to deal with getting those types of things taken down. But when a comment doesn't necessarily meet the test of, is this hate speech or not, or is it harassment or not, then you're ultimately bound to comply by the community standards of whichever platform you're using. And the platform sets those community standards, and they respond to how users on that platform engage with each other to form those community standards. And so yes, ultimately we form those, we shape those. It is a culture change. It will take a very long time. But there still needs to be a place, like Lynn said, where we can go online and tell a politician that we don't particularly agree with, that we don't particularly agree with them. And there are ways to do that without harassing them or committing an act of hate speech. This is a very fraught and complicated topic, and one that I don't think is going away.
So I know that we're super close on time, so unfortunately I'm going to invite all of you guys to come and talk to our panelists more during the break. I would like just a quick 30-second wrap-up from each of you guys. I'm going to ask a question that's not necessarily a softball, but hopefully will kind of be food for thought moving forward. We talked a lot today about incentives and accountability and responsibility and all these things, but these all sound like kind of long-term solutions. Collaboration is a long-term solution, and there's a federal election coming up very quickly. But at the same time, we have an incredible group of people in this room, some of the brightest minds in internet governance, and some people who have so much ability and networks and resources that they can use. So what can we do as a group between now and the federal election to take one step forward to combating this issue? And again, I know that that's a big question. So.
Oh, one step? One thing?
One thing.
I would say think before you react and think before you share. So if each of us just did that, if we read critically, so these are more than one thing, but it's all kind of under the one umbrella, but read laterally. And if you're all internet people, you already know this, so tell all your friends and your family. Don't read the internet like you read a newspaper or a book or print. You don't read it top to bottom. You read it sideways, right? Read laterally. Google that and learn more about what that is if you want to know. But that is the number one thing you can do to be a really great fact checker, to know the source that you're reading and then you're sharing and talking to your friends and family about and quoting is genuine and legit. Read laterally. Just exercise restraint. Ignore the clickbait. Just take a breath. Think twice. Check it out. It really will make a huge difference. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we've got some new research coming out. We're launching it tomorrow. And it does really clearly and plainly indicate that when you can safely and appropriately intervene, set the norms, do that. Just say, hey, you know, if it's not going to be many of us in this room, but if you're playing Fortnite and someone says, I don't want a girl on my team because girls are no good at gaming, you can just really nicely say, you know what, I love having girls on my team. They're some of the best players around. That's all it takes to really change the norms of the communities that we're creating online.
Of course, my answer is going to be you want to be reading globalnews.ca for most of your election campaign coverage. But one of the big unintended side effects, of course, is the internet. Was cookies are going to send you information that validates your worldview. You like this columnist, we're going to give you this columnist again and again. And so I would just say, I'm not saying you necessarily if you're. We need to find a common space. That was newspapers once upon a time. You flipped through the newspaper. You didn't know what you're going to expect on the next page. It might be something that angered you, inspired you. I didn't know that. But you learned about your neighbor, and you may have learned about your neighbor's views on something. So similarly, perhaps I encourage you, if you've never read, if you live in this part of the country, and you rarely or if ever read columnists who live in Vancouver or Edmonton, seek one or two of them out. If you find yourself, just take a look. Guy, I'm reading a lot of opinions here by men. Maybe go find an opinion by a female voter. What about a first-time voter? Can I find places at first-time voters? You may not know this, but Instagram is kind of where it's at for political activity right now among a lot of voters. They're communicating with each other on Instagram. Try and find some feeds. I can go on and on about how Twitter is an unbelievably efficient platform for plugging into networks and in minutes getting the zeitgeist of how a particular group, geography, interest, topic are talking about things. But it takes work. So curate your own feeds to push against the things you already think about. And I'm not talking, I believe in climate change scientists, so I'm going to read a climate denier. I don't mean that, but just regional differences, gender differences, age differences. Think and read about what your fellow voters are considering as they cast a ballot.
Thank you. And sorry, recognizing we're a little over time, I'm going to ask for like a 30-second, 2-sentence, one thing to do.
Yeah, consume content outside your comfort zone and stop rewarding clickbait and amplifying it in any way.
Ask your political parties or political parties you're interested in what their digital platform is and push them on their digital platform. This should be an election issue. It's not going to be, but it really should be something we're debating every year. New Zealand's done it. Canada should too.
Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.